I'm Shakila. In this video, we are going to explain the material about words and sentences, the interface between morphology and syntax. Before we start, let me share how each of us will explain the materials. I will explain the first part, introduction, argument structure, and morphology. Then, passive and anti-passive will be explained by Chesa, causative and obligative by Lyra, noun incorporation on the border and clitics by Dava, phrasal verbs and verbs with separable prefixes by Sarita, and finally, phrasal compound and the summary by Wafi. Alright, let's get started. This material talks about the relationship between morphology and syntax. Morphology is the study of word forms and how words are built, while syntax focuses on how words are arranged to form sentence. These two are closely related because changes in a word's form can affect how sentence is structured. One key concept here is verb valency. Valency refers to how many arguments a verb can take. Arguments are noun phrases that a verb needs. For example, the subject and object in a sentence. So, this part shows how word formation and sentence structure are connected and influence each other. Now, let's move on to argument structure and morphology. As mentioned earlier, the valency of a verb is the number of arguments it takes. Arguments are the phrases that are semantically necessary for the verb. It means they must appear for the sentence to sound complete. Let's see some examples. 1a. Fenster snores. We cannot just say snores. It sounds incomplete. That's because the verb snore only takes one argument, the subject fenster. It doesn't need an object. Verbs like this are called intransitive verb. It only needs a subject. 1b. Fenster devoured the pizza. Here, the verb devour needs two arguments, the subject fenster and the object the pizza. If we only say Fenster devoured or devoured the pizza, both are incorrect because one argument is missing. That's why devour a transitive verb. It needs both a subject and an object. 1c. Fenster put the wombat in the bathtub. This verb put needs three arguments, the subject fenster, the object the wombat, and the prepositional phrase in the bathtub. If we remove one of them, like fenster put the wombat, or fenster put in the bathtub, or fenster put, the sentences become ungrammatical. So, put is a ditransitive verb because it takes three arguments. We can also add extra phrases like time, place, or manner. For example, Fenster put the wombat in the bathtub with great care on Thursday. These phrases add more details, but they are not arguments. They are called adjuncts because they are not needed by the verb's meaning. So, this part applies the concept of valency changing morphology. It refers to any morphological process that changes how many arguments a verb takes. For example, making an intransitive verb become transitive or a transitive verb become intransitive. English has some of these processes, but other languages have even more. Alright, that's all for my part about argument structure and morphology. For the next material about passive and anti-passive, it will be explained by my friend Chesa.
Next material is about passive and anti-passive. But first, let's start with the passive. In English, the passive voice changes the structure of sentence by removing the subject or agent and making the object the main focus. For example, take the active sentence. Fencer beat the wombat. Here, fencer is the subject performing the action and the wombat is the object receiving it. If we change this sentence into the passive, it becomes the wombat was beat by fencer. Now, the object the wombat becomes the subject and the agent fencer is optional and comes after the word by. This shows one key feature of passive sentence. They shift the focus from who does the actions to what receives the action. This is very useful when the action itself or the object is more important than the agent. Another thing to notice is the verb form. In English, passive sentences use the auxiliary verb be plus the past participle of the main verb. For example, there are regular verb and irregular verb. So, every time you see a sentence with be plus past participle and the object appears as the subject, you are likely looking at a passive sentence. This structure allows us to reduce the number of arguments, meaning we don't need to explicitly mention the subject and it makes the object the start of the sentence. Alright, now it's about anti-passive. While English has this way of shifting focus using the passive, not all languages do it the same way. Some languages, especially those with ergative absolutive system, use construction called the antipassive, which also reduces the number of arguments but in different way. It downplays or removes the object rather than the subject. In a passive sentence, the subject of the active sentence can disappear or appear only in prepositional phrase, like in the apple is eaten by the woman, where the woman is no longer the main subject. In contrast, in the antipassive, the object is omitted or backgrounded. For example, in eating, like this sentence. This sentence means this woman is eating. The verb eat is normally transitive, but with the suffix "in," it becomes intransitive, so it no longer requires an object because eating uses an ergative absolutive system. The subject of transitive verb normally takes the ergative case, while the subject of an intransitive verb takes the absolutive case. Here, this woman is absolutive because the sentence is now intransitive. Interestingly, the missing object in an antipassive sentence can still be mentioned, but in different cases, such as dative or placative. For example, like this sentence. So the sentence means the man saw the dog. The dog is still present, but is no longer the direct object. It now appears in the dative case. Even though translations into English may look the same, the grammatical structure is different because English does not have an antipassive. So, in short, passive sentence reduce or remove the role of the subject, while antipassive sentence reduce or remove the role of the object. Two different real languages shift focus between the actor and the actions recipient. The next material about causative and applicative will be explained by Lira.
Now, let's move to the next topic, causatives and applicatives. Some morphological processes can change the valency of a verb. They can either add or reduce arguments. Causative and applicative are examples that add arguments. The first one, causatives. Causatives are morphological processes that add a new argument to a verb. Usually, a subject causes an action to happen. In other words, the causative form expresses that someone makes something happen. For example, in Swahili, we have maji yamechemka, which means the water boiled. Here, there is only one argument, water. which is the patient or theme. Badru alichem samaji. Badru boiled the water. Now, a new subject argument Badru is added. So the verb now has two arguments, the causative Badru and the theme water. In short, the causative suffix sh increases the valency of a verb by adding a new subject. Let's look another example of causative's morphology. Also in Swahili, Halima alikipika chakula, which means Halima cooked the food. The verb cook has two arguments, Halima, the agent or the causer, and food, the patient. Juma alim pikir Halima chakula. Juma caused Halima to cook food. Now we have a third argument, Juma, who is the causer. The verb form pikis includes the causative morpheme ish. So, again, the causative adds an argument to the verb. The second one, applicatives. Like causatives, applicatives also add a new argument to the verb. But this time, it's not a subject, it's a new object. Applicative morphology allows a verb to include an extra participant such as beneficiary, instrument, or location. Let's look at the example, still in Swahili. Nilipika chakula, which means I cook food. The verb cook has one object, food. Nilimpiki achakula Juma, which means I cook some food for Juma. Here, the suffix e and a marks the applicative form, and a new object, Juma, is added. So, the applicative suffix increases the verb's valency by adding an additional object, not a subject. To sum up, causative add a causer, a new subject who initiate the action, while applicatives had a beneficiary or another new object that participates in the action. Both of them show how morphology can change the argument structure of a verb. In other words, how many participants are involved in an event. That's all from me. Thank you.
Okay, let's continue our material, that is noun incorporation. Noun incorporation is a process where a noun combines directly with a verb, forming one complex word instead of two separate words. In the Mapudungun language of Chile, we have two ways to say my father is looking for the cows. That is the sentence Ni chau kintu le tachipuwaka and Ni chau kintu wakale. Both of sentences mean the same thing, but in the second version, the noun waka is incorporated into the verb kintu. So what used to be a separated object in the syntax now becomes part of the verb morphology. This shows how morphological processes can affect the argument structure of verbs, or an area traditionally studied in syntax. Noun incorporation is a common in a polysynthetic language where a single word can express an entire sentence. It's a clear example of how the boundary between morphology and syntax is not always fixed. This leads us to a bigger idea in linguistics. Sometimes we encounter forms that are not clearly morphological but also not purely synthetic. These forms live on the borders between the two systems. For instance, morphology can influence how many arguments a verb takes, something we normally think of as syntax, or syntax can affect how words are structured. In this borderland is where morphology and syntax interact most closely, creating interesting hybrid forms that challenge our definition of what counts as a word. Next, that is clitics. One of the best examples of this borderland is clitics. A clitic is a small grammatical element that cannot stand on its own, but also is not tightly bound like an affix. Phonologically, a clitic attaches to a nearby word, called its host, and forms one unit with it. However, syntactically it still behaves like an independent word. There are two types of clitics. The first is simple clitics and the second is special clitics. Let's discuss simple clitics first. In English, we have simple clitics in constructions, like in sentence, I'll take the sandwich and I'd like the sandwich. These endings L and D are reduced forms of will and would. They attach to whatever comes before, not just nouns or verbs. So we can also say, the kid over there take one, or no one I know won one. They're phonologically attached, but syntactically free. That's what makes them clitics, not affixes. Next is special clitics. Now, in French, we find a different type called special clitics. For example, the sentence like "Je vois Pierre" and "Je le vois" is the meaning like I see Pierre and I see him. But "je vois" is ungrammatical. The pronoun is phonologically dependent on the verb but cannot stand alone. There's no free word meaning him. So, la is a special clitic, neither a word nor a true affix. So, clitics are fascinating because they share features of both morphemes and syntactic words. Like morphemes, they depend on a house, but like words, they have grammatical function and appear in sentence position. That's why linguists describe clitics as borderline creatures, living right between morphology and syntax. I think that's all from me. The next material will be explained by Sarita.
Hi everyone, today I'm going to talk about phrasal verbs in English and verbs with separable prefixes in Dutch. This topic is really interesting because these types of verbs sit right between morphology, how words are formed, and syntax, how words are arranged in sentence. So let's get started. First, let's look at phrasal verb in English. A phrasal verb is a combination of a verb and a particle, which can be a preposition or an adverb. For example, call up means to telephones, chew out means to scold, put down means to insult, and run up means to accumulate. These verbs often have idiomatic meanings. That means their meanings cannot always be guessed from the individual words. For example, call up doesn't literally mean to call up words. It just means to make a phone call. How phrasal verbs behave in sentence. Now, the structure of phrasal verbs is quite special. Unlike compound words like dog, bat, the two parts of a phrasal verb can actually be separated. Let's look at an example. I called up a friend. I called a friend up. Both of these sentences are correct, but when the object is pronoun, it must go between the verb and the particle. So we say, I called her up, not I called up her. So the position of the particle depends on what kind of object we have in sentence. Here's the big question. Are phrasal verbs part of morphology because they behave like one unit of meaning, or are they part of syntax because their elements can be moved around in sentence? Well, there is no clear answer. That's why linguists say that phrasal verbs exist on the border between morphology and syntax. Now let's look at Dutch, because it has something very similar to English phrasal verbs. They're called separable prefix verb. These verbs are made of two parts, a prefix and main verb. Let's take an example. Opballen. It comes from op, which means up, and ballen, which means to call. So literally, opballen means to call up, and its meaning is just to telephone. In a sentence, these two parts can split apart. For example, Hans belled sein mother up. This means Hans called his mother up. Here, belde is the past form of bellen, and up moves to the end of the sentences. The same thing happens with other verbs. Schoonmaken comes from schoon, meaning clean, and maken, to make. So, it means to clean. Example, Jan maakte het huis schoon means Jan cleaned the house. So, just like English phrasal verbs, these Dutch verbs can split into two parts depending on how the sentence is structured. In Dutch, the position of the verbs depends on the type of clause. In a main clause, the main verb usually comes in the second position, but in the subordinate clause, the verb moves to the end of the sentence. That's why in some sentences, the prefix gets separated from the verb. So even though these verbs look like compounds, they can behave synthetically, just like English phrasal verbs. Alright, that's all from me, and the next material will be explained by my friends.
After learning about phrasal verbs and verbs with separable prefixes, we can see how words can interact within syntax. In my part, we'll move a little further and look at how phrases themselves can become part of one word. This phenomenon is called phrasal compounds, and it perfectly shows how morphology and syntax are linked. So, what exactly is a phrasal compound? Basically, it's a word that is made up of a phrase plus a noun. Instead of combining just two simple words like in normal compounds, here we combine a whole phrase or even a short sentence with a noun to form one single word. Let's look at some examples in English. We can find phrases like stuff blowing up effects, bikini girls in trouble genre, and comic book and science fiction fans. If you look closely, the first part in each example is a phrase, like stuff blowing up or bikini girls in trouble. And the second part is the main noun, such as effects, genre, or fans. Even though they look like phrases, they actually behave like single words. Now, how do we know that? Well, one way to check is by trying to put another word inside. For example, you cannot say stuff blowing up exciting effects. That sounds wrong. But you can say exciting stuff blowing up effects. This shows that stuff blowing up effects function as one single unit, just like a word. Interestingly, this type of construction doesn't only exist in English. Languages like Dutch and German also have similar examples. In Dutch, there is lachen shit humor, which literally means laugh or I shoot humor. And in German, there is die Frage, which means the who was that question. So in these languages too, full phrases or even short sentences can appear inside one single word. Now, what makes phrasal compounds so special is that they kind of live in between morphology and syntax. On one hand, the phrase inside belongs to syntax because syntax deals with phrases and sentence structures. But On the other hand, the whole thing behaves like a word, which is the concern of morphology. So it's not really easy to decide whether phrasal compounds belong to one field or the other. That's why both morphologists and syntacticians are interested in them. Finally, a phrasal compound is basically a word formed from a phrase plus a noun, like God is dead theology or comic book and science fiction fans. It's one of the clearest examples showing how words and sentences, or morphology and syntax, are closely connected. So, to conclude, this chapter shows how words and sentences are connected through the relationship between morphology and syntax. Morphology focuses on how words are formed, and syntax focuses on how words are arranged into sentences. But as we've seen, these two areas are not completely separate. They often overlap and work together. We can see this connection in examples like phrasal verbs, verbs with separable prefixes, and phrasal compounds. Each of these shows that sometimes a phrase can behave like one single word, or a word can act like part of a sentence. In short, morphology and syntax support each other in shaping the structure and meaning of language. Words don't stand alone. They are part of a larger system that helps us build meaning and communication. That's all for our presentation. Thank you for watching and listening.